says a migrant ship has sunk off the coast of Libya. 100 refugees are feared to have drowned, including several children and babies.
Police in Maryland say the newspaper shooter barricaded the back door and worked his way through the newsroom, shooting and killing his 5 victims.
The door of the Capitol Gazette had been blown to pieces. It was in shattered pieces all on the carpet. And this guy was holding what looked like a big shotgun.
President Trump is celebrating 6 months since the rollout of his tax plan, but a trade war is causing higher prices and market volatility. The president is ignoring it.
The economy is indeed doing well.
From the I24NEWS studios in Times Square in New York, this is Crossroads with David Schuster and Tal Heinrich.
There has been a heart-wrenching tragedy off of the coast of Libya. A refugee ship carrying around 100 migrants has sunk. 3 babies have been found dead. Only 14 people have been rescued alive.
The accident came just as European Union leaders reached a tentative agreement in Brussels on how to handle the flow of migrants, but not all of the nations are on the same page. I24NEWS correspondent Marcus White has the latest.
These Libyan migrants embarked on the difficult and dangerous journey across the Mediterranean Sea towards Europe. But on Friday, the European Union-backed Libya Coast Guard intercepted their boat and brought the 345 migrants back to the Libyan capital of Tripoli. Though their plans for a new life were upended, they were some of the lucky ones. In a separate incident, Coast Guard officials say about 100 migrants drowned when their vessel capsized off of Libya's western coast on Friday. 3 babies are among the dead, and just over a dozen were rescued. Libya's western coast is a main point where thousands fleeing poverty and war risk their lives to reach Europe. For about 3 years, Europe has been struggling with how to handle an influx of migrants from Africa and the Middle East. Refugee camps in Italy and France are crowded. Officials say about 56,000 migrants have arrived in Europe so far this year. European Union leaders met in Brussels this week to try and hash out the migration crisis. After all-night discussions on Thursday, the EU struck a deal. The leaders agreed on setting up disembarkation platforms, most likely in North Africa, to discourage migrants from boarding smuggling boats heading to Europe. Under the deal, EU member nations can also elect to set up migrant processing centers to determine whether migrant arrivals should be returned home or admitted as refugees. The agreement also calls for more investment in Africa to help its civilians live a better life. French President Emmanuel Macron is praising the deal.
We did not give in to the worst of expectations. We came back to the facts, to the vital elements of responsibility and solidarity, which must continue to build our Europe. And in doing so, we were able to build, and I think I can say this, a significant agreement, which is just one step forward.
Other EU leaders agree there's still more work to be done.
We are, of course, not at the end of the road, but you can imagine that the perspectives were extremely different under the member states.
Marcus White, I24NEWS.
Israel is preparing for the possibility that tens of thousands of Syrian refugees could start heading towards its northern border in the days ahead. And early this morning, Israeli military forces say they completed a major mission.
The Israeli forces say they transported and delivered tons of humanitarian aid to help Syrian families who have tried to flee Assad's artillery fire. Meanwhile, on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights, refugee encampments are growing. I24NEWS senior defense correspondent Shai Ben-Ari has the latest.
We're here on the Israel-Syria border, very close to the border fence, in fact. I want to give you a look at what's happening here in the background. Our camerawoman, Anastasia, can zoom in on some of the objects that you can see just past the border fence there. You can make out, I think, tents right along the border, really, that have been erected there. We don't know exactly how long these particular tents have been there, but it's interesting to note that we do know that certain refugee camps have been erected here in the central border region, as well as previously to the south. Further south from here, and you can see that these tents are very close to a UN base, also situated right along the border fence. It seems that these refugees have located themselves here to seek the protection of the UN, as well as a certain umbrella of protection provided by the presence, of course, of Israel here. The Syrian regime generally does not try to approach the Israeli border, not seeking any trouble with Israel, and that offers a certain indirect sort of protection for the refugees here. The IDF, the Israeli army, of course, overnight transferring a lot of humanitarian aid into the hands of these refugees who have gathered at different camps along the border. Some 15 tons of food in addition to 13 tons of baby food, as well as 30 tons of clothing, all the while saying that Israel will not actually allow refugees into its own territory. We were able to speak to some of the Israeli residents of this area to get their thoughts on this, whether they think that Israel should actually open the gates or not. Let's hear what some had to say.
The education in Syria shows that Israel are the enemy. And it's to, even if we don't see them as our enemy, and I'm talking about the innocent people in Syria, I don't sure that they feel the same way about those. So even if they are just looking for a way to get out right now, it doesn't matter where, I don't know if it's going to be a good thing for Israel that eventually their education is going to allow them to be here.
We need to do everything necessary to save these people. Yeah, they were once our enemies, but it's a chance to show the other side, these poor people, that we're not what they were taught, the enemy with horns, that we're basically people like them.
Right, so some interesting voices there from Israeli residents of this area from the Israel-Syria border. Shai Ben Ari, I24 News.
To discuss all this, let's bring in Jonathan Wachtel, former spokesperson for the U.S. mission to the United Nations. And Jonathan, is it a wise idea for Syrians to try to get as close to the Israeli border as possible, knowing that the regime will not cause trouble there?
You know, they're obviously acting out of desperation. So when you're in a circumstance in which you're pinched in a corner and you really don't see any way out, you're going to do whatever you see fit, at least to try to survive. So it's hard to judge them and sort of coach them into doing the right thing, because the right thing may be the right thing is trying to rush to the border because they can get killed.
And it's pretty obvious why Israel cannot accept in Syrian refugees, but also Jordan is rejecting them. They say they cannot allow more refugees in. So what can they do, and what can Israel and Jordan do? Engage in the civil war militarily, maybe?
Look, we don't want to see, of course, an escalation to that level, but really you do have some players that need to get in there very hard right now, and one of those is the United Nations. That's what they're tasked to do. This is a peace and security issue. They need to get fully engaged into this problem. They've managed the Golan Heights, or they're supposed to be doing, in terms of a deconfliction zone, UNDOF, the UN troops there. You know, you got to beef it up and you got to take care of the situation so we don't end up with a greater problem here. If they can't, then of course it's a desperate situation. I feel for those poor people stuck in the middle.
This part of southwestern Syria, the United States and Russia had agreed that it would be a de-escalation zone. So doesn't that put some responsibility on the U.S. and Russia simply to enforce that?
Certainly on Russia it does, you know, but they so far seem to be showing signs that they just want Assad to wrap up operations and take control of his country.
Well, we have a summit coming up between President Trump and President Putin in this area of Syria. Will be heavily discussed over there. But let's shift to the EU summit in Brussels, where leaders agreed upon a few ideas. One of them is a disembarkation platform in North Africa, where migrants will be screened before boarding on these boats. What do you think about that? The Czech Prime Minister even called it Ellis Island.
It's an interesting concept. The problem is when you try to outsource a problem like this, you can run into all sorts of problems in the way it's handled. There have been horrific stories of, for instance, Libyan migrants who end up being enslaved because the process is so wrought with problems and lack of accountability. So if you're going to do this, if you're going to try to outsource the problem and keep them within country, you really have to do it right, because at the end of the day, you're going to end up with the same problem again, because if people are maltreated, they're going to flee.
It does seem like the problem is not as intense as it was 2 years ago, that the number of migrants who are leaving Africa and going to Europe has dropped. What do you attribute that to?
A couple of things. One is the horrific stories that obviously come back, in which you have, for instance, this tragedy of all these people dying trying to make the voyage across the sea. Issues of hearing about horrible people exploiting refugees trying to flee. Again, you had so many people in 2015. I think you had more than 1 million migrants trying to cross over. You know, there are only so many people, David. I mean, you know, the problem is dire, of course, but once you hear these horror stories and it resonates, and you know the dangers of making that voyage, and you find out that there's a Europe that might be hostile to taking you in at the final end of your destination, these things come back. There's a whole draconian process to this that is just horrific, and it's just real life stuff. life and death issues.
And it's not even one Europe. Europe is very much divided upon this topic. Can you explain the struggles?
The struggles are that, you know, America's problem with migration is very different because we're one unified country where it affects all the states together. But the European Union is a bundled together set of many nations, and each nation has its own outlook on the migration problem, the immigration problem. Austria, for instance, is landlocked. Why would they want to worry? I mean, they are led by a conservative government, and they have their own set of agendas in terms of populism and appeal for their, their public. But Austria, compared to Italy, let's say, where Italy receives a lot of migrants because it's surrounded by the sea. That's the destination point coming from North Africa. Well, Austria doesn't want to be a part of this. You know, why are you bugging me? Why are you knocking on my door? Why are you asking me to contribute some sort of funds or set up a center to try to process people in my landlocked country when I have nothing to do with this problem? And that goes across the board in various countries. Germany's got issues. Angela Merkel's overwhelmed with all the immigrants she took a lot of political heat for that, is getting a lot of heat right now from her interior minister, who's right of her position. It's a very complicated situation, and each European country has their own agenda and needs, as if they're little Americas trying to cope with a problem that we're trying to deal with in our country.
Jonathan Wachtel, former spokesperson for the U.S. mission to the United Nations. Jonathan, thanks as always. We appreciate it. Coming up, the Maryland newspaper massacre. We will have the latest from investigators on the shooter's motive.
Plus, Prince William is departing Israel after the first official royal visit to the region. Did he stay out of politics as he said he would? We'll take a look after the break.
Maryland police say 38-year-old Jared Ramos, the man who allegedly opened fire at a newspaper, killing 5 employees, barricaded the back door before shooting his way through the front.
Despite the tragedy, the Capital Gazette still published an issue this morning. Condolences have come in from across the country, from local memorials to a statement from the president. Correspondent Janae Norman has the latest.
New details about the gunman, armed with a shotgun and smoke grenades, who authorities say targeted a newsroom.
We brought to the judge's attention the evidence that suggested a coordinated attack, the barricading of a back door, and the use of a tactical approach and hunting down and shooting the innocent victims in this case.
The suspect, 38-year-old Jared Ramos, killing 5 people, all who worked for the Capital Gazette newspaper. The victims, Wendy Winters, a special publication editor, editorial page editor Gerald Fishman, sports reporter John McNamara, sales assistant Rebecca Smith, and editor and columnist Rob Hyacin.
This was a targeted attack.
Ramos sued the paper for defamation in 2012 after the Gazette reported on his guilty plea in a stalking case in 2011. The lawsuit was dismissed, but a retired editor for the Gazette says for years Ramos made threats against the paper on social media.
He had actually contacted the police to pursue one particular comment in which he wished me dead.
Police revealing those threats continued until as recently as Thursday, and they'd investigated Ramos before.
In May of 2013, we did have a situation where online threatening comments were made. We had a detective assigned to investigate it.
And that was correspondent Janae Norman, who joins us now from Annapolis, Maryland. And Janae, first, how is the community there doing with all of this?
Well, there's actually a growing memorial here behind me across the street out in front of the building where this all happened yesterday. This is the paper that the Capital Gazette came out with today. They were determined to put out a paper honoring those victims, their co-workers, as the rest of the community is honoring them. A vigil scheduled for tonight, and we have learned that 2 others who were shot and hospitalized have been released from the hospital today. Officials say that Ramos has not been cooperative. He's behind bars without bond. A judge saying he believes Ramos is a danger to the community. Back to you.
And Janae, as more details transpired today, it seems that not only that this attack was targeted, it was very much calculated, right?
Absolutely, that is what officials are telling us. As you heard in the story there, kind of a tactical approach. He had a history with the newspaper, filed a lawsuit for defamation some years ago. So some connection there, and even past employees telling us that they were aware of the threats he'd made.
And Janae, is there any more indication as to whether there was some specific triggering event just over the past couple of days? I mean, he's had this dispute with the newspaper for several years. Anybody have any idea why now? What caused him to do this now?
At this point, that's still something we're waiting to find out. Still lots of questions. And again, officials saying that he's not cooperating, so not helping to answer any of those questions. But as you mentioned, yes, that lawsuit was some years ago. But police saying that those threats continued up until yesterday before the shooting happened. So still waiting to find out what may have been a triggering event, if there was one at all. Back to you.
Janai Norman in Annapolis, thank you. And for more on that, on forensics and the motive of the shooter, we'll bring David Katz, Global Security Group founder and CEO. David, what are your thoughts following yesterday's attack? Do you think there's something that could have been done maybe to save more people's lives?
Well, there's a two-pronged approach. The first is everyone really needs to be familiar with the proper steps to take if, God forbid, they're confronted by an active shooter. And there's training. We do it, for example, for corporate clients all over the world. But the other thing is there's an assessment process that most people really don't pay attention to. So there is a body of data which reveals that there are certain behavioral characteristics and personality traits that are suggestive that certain people are prone to violence. So, for example, if you have a threat or a lawsuit or a disgruntled employee, the list can go on, and they exhibit, we have a checklist that we do it with, and they exhibit a certain number of these characteristics, you know that there is I wouldn't say a likelihood, but there is a suggestion, potential for violence, and then you have to take action. For example, access control would be the first thing on my mind. Constant monitoring of social media, for example. If you have someone who's targeting you as a company, it's incumbent upon you to take those measures. It's not a police function. It's no longer a police function once you become aware of it. You make the police report. If there's no criminal action that the subject has undertaken that could lead to arrest or prosecution, then you have to take steps to measure to keep your people safe.
How new is this evaluation system? Because it sounds like in this particular case, the newspaper had an opportunity a couple of years ago to press some sort of charges against this guy, but felt that would exacerbate the situation. They were trying to keep it sort of tamped down. Yeah, that generally doesn't work. So the answer to your question is we've actually just started doing that in-house in the last half year or so. Interestingly, this last March, Secret Service put out a good study on active shooter incidents, actually violence in public spaces, and they analyzed the perpetrators with a variety of measures, mostly what are they doing, what are their behavioral traits, what type of personality do they have, and then you mentioned earlier, or you asked the question to the reporter, triggering events. There's always going to be a trigger. You're going to find there's a trigger in this case, but when you delve into this guy, you're going to find that his personality matches that whole profile. And when you see that, you have to take a little extra measures with respect to security.
Can you describe us a certain profile?
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, you're going to see, number one, mental illness is overwhelmingly seen in these cases, or some sort of treatment. It could be something as dramatic as literal psychosis, or it could be simple depression. Beyond that, you're going to have contact with law enforcement. We have it in this case. You're going to have behavioral issues, personality traits. One of the most common is something called aggressive narcissism. You know, I used to think, and I was actually incorrect, that most active shooters, for example, had some sort of withdrawn, shy, reticent, bullied. The bullying part may be true, but there's an aggressive narcissism that is, I think it's common in 82% of shooters, which is staggering. So if you see those things, for example, our checklist is like 50 questions, and it goes through each one of them. And again, it's not indicative. It's not dispositive of the issue. It just tells you, look, this person is indicating a lot of the traits that make us at least need to take a few extra steps to keep our place secure. Given those traits, any surprise that this particular suspect is not cooperating now? He's not giving much information? No, I mean, if what they're saying is true, for example, apparently he mutilated his fingertips. That's extraordinary. I mean, that's an extraordinary step. You saw that years and years ago in the 1930s with gangsters trying to elude law enforcement. That's a very unusual thing. So he probably has some mental illness. He clearly planned this in great detail. was very, very careful in that planning process. So I'm not surprised he's not cooperating. I mean, why would he? It's nothing to his advantage.
David Katz, Global Security Group founder and CEO. David, thanks for coming in. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Up next on Crossroads, Israel's sympathizers tortured by the Palestinian Authority have won a major legal victory.
And President Trump is taking a victory lap over his tax plan, even though one of his former advisors says that the gains from the tax plan, well, they're being wiped out by the trade war. Britain's Prince William has now wrapped up his 5-day trip to the Middle East.
You know why? Because it's so hot in London. Well, he's the first British royal to make an official visit to Israel and the Palestinian territories. I24 News correspondent Emily Rose reports.
Britain's Prince William concluded his Middle East tour with a visit to Jerusalem's Old City. He visited the Al-Aqsa compound, known by Muslims as Haram al-Sharif, and to the Jews as the Temple Mount. There, he met with the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and other Muslim dignitaries. The holy site in the past has been an epicenter for clashes and controversy. The visit dominated Palestinian news headlines as the Al-Quds newspaper boasted, "Prince concludes his visit to Palestine with visit to Jerusalem's Old City." The Al-Ayam newspaper reported that Prince William asked a child if Palestinian youth were allowed to visit the mosque compound, and the answer he received was no, as Palestinians from Gaza are still forbidden entry. Because a British monarch is not a political official, the prince's visit was largely symbolic, but his choice of words carried weight. During a visit with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, he used the word countries to describe the Palestinian territories, even though the UK does not officially recognize the territory as such.
And I'm very glad that our two countries work so closely together and have had success stories with education and relief work in the past. So long may that continue. And my sentiments are the same as yours in hoping that there's a lasting peace for the region.
And his choice of words during a speech at the British consulate further emphasized support for the Palestinian cause.
My message tonight is that you have not been forgotten. It has been a very powerful experience to meet you and other Palestinians living in the West Bank and to hear your stories.
As the prince heads back to London, the symbolism of his visit remains in the region. Emily Rose, I24 News.
At the border between Israel and Gaza, 2 Palestinians were killed by Israeli forces, one of them a 14-year-old boy. Over 400 others on Friday were wounded during the protests by live fire and tear gas.
The Gaza Health Ministry says the 14-year-old protester was shot in the head by an Israeli sniper and died at the hospital. Another 24-year-old was also killed in central Gaza. A health ministry spokesman says at least 135 Palestinians have been killed and more than 14,000 injured since the beginning of the protests in late March.
Now to a major story regarding Palestinians accused of aiding Israel that was first reported by Israeli media. The accused Palestinians allegedly suffered horrific abuse at the hands of the Palestinian Authority during interrogations.
The Palestinian plaintiffs sued the security officials in the Israeli courts and won. Israel has now ordered the Palestinian Authority to pay more than $3 million in compensation to the plaintiffs. I24 News correspondent Daniel Tzemach has the story.
15 years of deliberation over cases of extreme interrogation tactics allegedly utilized by the Palestinian Authority. An Israeli court ruled in favor of Palestinian and Arab Israeli plaintiffs believed to have been tortured.
They start with a simple method. They tie you up by your hands and feet, hands cuffed, bag over your head, and you don't see anything, just get hit until you pass out.
Mohammed, an assumed name, is one of 51 Palestinian or Arab Israeli plaintiffs accused of being an Israeli collaborator by the Palestinian Authority, an accusation that led to alleged abuse and torture at the hands of the PA. His testimonies, as those of his friends, are horrific.
The winning method? They take a glass Coca-Cola bottle, the top is broken, then they make you sit on it. From 1996 to this day, I'm bleeding.
Jerusalem's district court has ruled that the PA must pay around $3.5 million in compensation for the alleged torture.
I'm happy that the courts understood the horrific financial and physical distress suffered by the plaintiffs, distress caused by the harsh torture.
These cases of abuse occurred years ago, between 1990 and 2003, but courts have been deliberating ever since. Israeli security officials believe that the Palestinian Authority has changed its methods of interrogation, assuming such torturous methods are no longer used. Meanwhile, the Palestinian Authority denies employing such extreme tactics. If the Palestinian Authority is unable to provide the compensation, it is expected the sum will be deducted from tax revenue collected by Israel on behalf of the PA. Daniel Tzemach, I24 News.
I was just going to ask you how they enforce it, but he just answered it. They'll deduct it from the tax money that they give the Palestinians.
Right. That's one way to do it, or they will pay. I don't think the Palestinian Authority will give Israel the money for this ruling.
Yeah, I agree. Still ahead, Israel is marking the anniversary of the deaths of the 3 young kidnapping victims. We'll take a look at the unique way that Israeli soldiers tried to find them.
Plus, the trade war between the U.S. and Canada is intensifying. More on I24 News after the break.